Okay, let's jump right in. We're doing a deep dive today into Acts chapter 24.
Right, Paul's trial before the Roman governor Felix in Caesarea, a really pivotal moment.
Absolutely. So Paul's been arrested, moved out of Jerusalem, and now he's in Caesarea facing the Roman legal system. The big question is, who's actually making the case against him? And, what are they claiming?
Well, the text tells us that 5 days after Paul arrived, the prosecution shows up, and they've come down from Jerusalem.
And it's a serious delegation, right?
Right.
Not just anyone.
Oh, yeah, definitely. You've got Ananias, the high priest himself. Some elders are there too, key leaders.
Wow, the high priest in person.
Exactly. And they didn't come alone. They brought a lawyer, a professional orator named Tertullus, to actually present the case.
Bringing in the legal expert. That tells you something about how seriously the Jewish authorities were taking this.
It really does. And Tertullus, well, he knows how to start things off.
How so?
He begins with this really elaborate flattery aimed at Felix, praising his administration, talking about the peace and reforms under his rule.
Ah, the classic buttering up technique.
Totally. He says things like, they appreciate his rule everywhere and in every way with profound gratitude, just laying it on thick.
Trying to get the judge on side before even mentioning Paul, it feels very different from how we might imagine a court today.
It's certainly strategic. You make the judge feel good, maybe more receptive, and only then does he get to the accusations against Paul.
Okay, so after the compliments, what are the actual charges?
They're pretty broad and pretty serious. First, he calls Paul a troublemaker, a pestilent fellow, some translations say.
A troublemaker? How?
Stirring up riots, Tertullus claims. And not just locally, but among Jews all over the world. He's painting Paul as this, global agitator.
A global menace. That's a huge claim. What else?
Then he targets Paul's group, calling him a ringleader of the Nazarene sect.
Sect. That frames it as something outside mainstream Judaism, maybe even dangerous, right?
Yeah, exactly. It implies it's divisive, maybe illegitimate. And then comes the really explosive charge, especially in that context,
Which is?
that Paul tried to desecrate the temple.
Whoa, okay. Trying to profane the temple. That's incredibly serious in Jerusalem.
Mm.
That's not just illegal, it's deeply offensive religiously.
Precisely. It's designed to hit hard. And the text adds that the other Jews there, Ananias and the elders, they backed him up. They joined in the accusation, asserting that these things were true.
So a united front from the prosecution.
Yeah. And Tertullus finishes by suggesting Felix can find out the truth himself just by examining Paul. Sort of a go ahead, ask him, he'll prove our point kind of move.
Confident, or perhaps hoping Paul trips himself up.
Yeah.
Okay, so the prosecution rests its case. Troublemaker, sect leader, attempted temple desecration, high stakes. What about Paul? How does he respond when he has the chance?
Well, Felix gives him the signal, and Paul starts his defense. He's respectful to Felix, too, acknowledging his experience as a judge, says he gladly makes his defense.
Similar form to Tertullus, but I imagine the content is different.
Very different. No flattery, really. He goes straight for the facts, challenging their narrative.
How does he do that?
First, he tackles that global troublemaker idea by pointing out the timeline. He says, basically, you can easily check this, Felix. It's only been 12 days since I came up to Jerusalem to worship.
12 days. That immediately shrinks the time frame, doesn't it? Hard to cause global riots in under 2 weeks while you're supposedly there to worship?
Exactly. It's a factual anchor. He's asking, how could I have done all this widespread rioting and temple desecration in just 12 days, especially when my purpose was worship?
It undermines their big claims right away.
What else? He directly denies the troublemaker charge in Jerusalem itself. He says, my accusers did not find me arguing with anyone at the temple or stirring up a crowd in the synagogues or anywhere else in the city.
So, no public disturbances. He's saying there's no local evidence for their claims.
Right. And he pushes them on it. He says they cannot prove the charges they are making now. He's challenging them for evidence right there in court.
Bold move. Put up or shut up, essentially.
Pretty much. But then he makes a really important clarification, or admission, depending on how you look at it.
Okay.
He says, however, I admit that I worship the God of our fathers as a follower of the way, which they call a sect.
Ah, so he owns being part of the way, what we know is early Christianity, but he frames it carefully.
Very carefully. He insists he worships the same God, the God of their ancestors. He's positioning the way within Judaism not as something totally alien. He's pushing back on that sect label, even while acknowledging they use it.
And doesn't he also say he believes in the scriptures?
Yes, exactly. He affirms his belief in everything that agrees with the law and that is written in the prophets. He's saying, my foundation is the same as yours.
He's trying to find common ground, even amidst the conflict.
Right. And he highlights another piece of shared belief, which is pretty interesting given the context. He says he has the same hope in God as these men, specifically the hope in a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked.
That's fascinating because the resurrection was a major dividing line within Judaism, particularly between Pharisees and Sadducees.
Precisely. By bringing it up, he might be subtly pointing out that his accusers aren't even fully united on all theological points themselves, and maybe suggesting the real issue is this theological belief, not sedition or sacrilege.
That's quite strategic. He also talks about his own motivation, doesn't he, about his conscience?
Yeah, he says his goal is always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. It's a statement about personal integrity.
And he gives his reason for being in Jerusalem in the first place, which, again, counters their narrative.
Right, he wasn't there to cause trouble after years away. He says he came to bring gifts for the poor and to present offerings, charity and religious duty.
So a mission of peace and piety, not insurrection.
That's the picture he paints. And he stresses that when they actually did find him in the temple, the place he supposedly tried to desecrate, he was ceremonially clean, wasn't causing a disturbance, wasn't even with a crowd.
He's systematically taking apart their case, point by point. Clean presence, no crowd, no riot.
Exactly. Providing an alternative, peaceful explanation for his presence. And then he turns the tables a bit.
How so?
He asks where the original accusers are. The Jews from Asia, who the book of Acts says were the ones who first stirred up trouble against him in the temple area. He basically says they should be here making these charges if they're true.
Good point. It's like asking, where are your key witnesses? Makes the prosecution's case seem weaker if they're absent.
Definitely. And then he challenges the people present, Ananias and the elders, to state what crime, what actual wrongdoing they found him guilty of when he stood before their own council, the Sanhedrin, back in Jerusalem.
Implying they found nothing then either.
Right. Unless, he says, unless it was about one specific thing he shouted out during that Sanhedrin hearing.
And he tells Felix what that was.
He does. He reveals it. It is concerning the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you today.
Wow. So he lands firmly on, this isn't about Roman law, it's about a Jewish theological dispute over the resurrection. That's the real reason I'm here.
That's his core argument, reframing the whole conflict.
Okay, so Paul delivers this detailed, reasoned defense, challenging the facts, clarifying his beliefs, and pointing to the religious roots of the conflict. How does Felix, the governor, react to all this?
Well, the text gives us a crucial piece of information. Felix was well acquainted with the way.
Ah, so this wasn't the first time he'd heard about Christianity or followers of Jesus. He had some prior knowledge.
Seems so, which likely plays into his response. He doesn't make an immediate ruling for or against Paul.
What does he do instead?
He adjourns the hearing, puts it on pause. He says he'll decide the case when Lysias, the military commander from Jerusalem who arrested Paul, comes down.
Waiting for more information. Or maybe just delaying a difficult decision.
Could be a bit of both, you know. It's hard to say for sure. But his orders about Paul's custody are interesting.
How so?
He tells the centurion guarding Paul to keep him secure, but to allow him some freedom and let his friends visit and take care of his needs.
That doesn't sound like someone convicted of trying to desecrate the temple or start riots. Some freedom, access to friends. It suggests Felix wasn't entirely convinced by the prosecution, perhaps?
It certainly suggests he didn't see Paul as an immediate high-level threat needing maximum security. Maybe Paul's defense or Felix's own knowledge tempered his view. But the story doesn't quite end there. It gets more complicated.
Oh, what happens next?
Several days later, Felix sends for Paul again. This time, his wife Drusilla is with him. And the text specifically notes she was Jewish.
Interesting detail. So a Jewish woman listening in on this conversation about the way.
Right. And Paul apparently talks to them about some core themes, faith in Christ Jesus, but also specifically about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come.
Oof. Righteousness, self-control, and judgment. Those sound like potentially uncomfortable topics for a Roman governor, especially one like Felix who had a bit of a reputation.
You'd think so, and the reaction described is pretty telling. It says Felix became afraid.
Afraid?
Yeah, afraid. And he cuts Paul off, saying, "That's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you."
So Paul's message actually provoked fear in him. That's powerful. He didn't just dismiss it. It hit a nerve.
It seems that way, but then the text reveals, well, a less noble reason for Felix continuing to summon Paul.
Oh, what was it?
It says Felix was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe.
Ah. So the repeat audiences weren't just for spiritual discussion or legal clarification. He was looking for a payout.
That's what the text explicitly states. He kept sending for Paul frequently, talking with him, because he hoped Paul, or maybe his friends visiting him, would cough up some money for his release. Classic corruption.
So Paul's imprisonment drags on, partly because the judge is hoping for a bribe that Paul presumably doesn't offer.
Exactly, and this goes on for a significant amount of time.
How long?
The text says, when 2 years had passed. 2 full years.
2 years Paul spends in this legal limbo in Caesarea, waiting while Felix hopes for a bribe. That's quite something.
It is. And then Felix's term as governor ends. He's succeeded by a man named Porcius Festus.
Okay, so a new governor. Does Felix finally make a decision about Paul before he leaves? Release him, send him on.
He makes a decision, but it's not based on justice or the bribe he never got. The text says, because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison.
Wow. So after 2 years, his final act regarding Paul is purely political calculation, to keep the Jewish leaders happy as he's leaving office.
Seems that way. Appeasing Paul's accusers was more important to him at that point than resolving the case based on its merits, or lack thereof. Paul gets left behind for the next governor to deal with.
So this whole episode in Acts 24, it starts with serious accusations, a formal defense, but then gets bogged down in delay, greed, and political maneuvering. Justice seems almost beside the point by the end.
It really highlights how messy things could be. Legal systems aren't always just about law, are they?
Definitely not. So when you think about this whole chapter, this deep dive, what does it really mean for you listening today?
Well, first you get this raw look at power dynamics. You see the accusers using their influence, Tertullus using rhetoric. You see Paul using facts and faith in his defense. And then you see the judge, Felix, caught between maybe wanting information, definitely wanting a bribe, and ultimately choosing political convenience. It shows how justice can get twisted.
Yeah, it's a sobering look at how systems work, or don't work sometimes.
And you also see Paul, right, standing firm in his beliefs. They call his faith a sect, they accuse him of terrible things, but he doesn't back down on who he is or what he believes about the way and the resurrection. It's a powerful image of conviction under pressure.
Holding on to your core identity even when it's attacked or misunderstood.
Exactly, and the detail about Felix already knowing something at the way, but still letting politics and greed dictate his actions. That's telling too, isn't it? Knowledge doesn't always lead to the right action, especially when self-interest gets in the way.
It really gives you a specific window into the complexities of that first-century world, Roman law, Jewish religious tensions, political realities, all colliding.
For sure. It wasn't simple. Paul had to navigate all of that.
So here's a thought to leave you with. Paul's trial gets paused, delayed for years, swayed by hopes of a bribe, and ultimately decided by political favor. Yet through it all, his core message about faith in Jesus, about righteousness, self-control, judgment, the resurrection that remained consistent. What does this story suggest about the nature of truth and conviction when they have to navigate systems driven by completely different, often self-serving motivations?